final day of the World Blitz Championship didn't run smoothly for any of the participants. If you remember, Hikaru Nakamura was leading the tournament after day one, but he started day two with just a half point out of 2 games, allowing others to catch up. Nevertheless, we know that Hikaru is a real fighter, and he fought back. This is his penultimate round game. Nakamura playing black against Vincent Keymer. Well, you can see the outlines of a King's Indian pawn structure. And in fact, although Keymer is a piece down in this position, he's doing pretty well. Nakamura played Rook F8, with looks like maybe some threats down the F file. But here Keymer got spooked and he fell back passively. He should just take here and go for an endgame. And in this position, this is very dangerous for black, with this pawn attacked and these two near to touchdown. But instead, Keymer was spooked, fell back, protecting this pawn, but then Nakamura took the initiative, and very quickly it went very wrong for white. And here, well, the extra piece told for black. Having got rid of that one, then this one isn't too much of a threat. So Nakamura fought back, so he put himself in contention going to the final round. Another player also in contention was Jan-Krzysztof Duda. Well, he outplayed Andreikin in the penultimate round. So here, Duda with black broke through to the king with g4. Andreikin tried to keep it closed with h4, but then queen e7, switching to the king side. Queen takes pawn, and then it was all over. Checkmate on the d1 square. So Duda was in a good position going into the final round. What about Magnus Carlsen? Well, he had his ups and downs as well, but he was taking no prisoners. He had no draws in the first few rounds of day two. Although, a lot of his games looked like, well, some of his games looked like a draw was on the cards. I mean, this is a typical example. So this is from the penultimate round. Carlsen with black, Shimonov playing white. Well, you can see it's almost a totally symmetrical position. Carlsen succeeded in winning this. It's incredible. A typical Carlsen grind. And they reached this endgame. And Carlsen had set up this little trick with the pawn on a4, pawn on b2, bishop c1. It's a very well-known mechanism. Here, and then you can sack the bishop. And here Shimonov resigned, because if knight takes a3, and that pawn is going through, completely unstoppable. It's incredible how Magnus managed to keep control and play, such a beautiful positional game, a positional squeeze. And wasn't the only game in which he did that. So anyway, that victory in the penultimate round meant that going into the final round, Carlsen had 15 points. He was a half point ahead of Nakamura and Duda on 14.5. So all to play for in this final round, absolutely crucial. And in the final round, Carlsen had a tricky pairing against Nodirbek Abdusattorov. We know he is a force to be reckoned with. World Rapid Play champion last year. Gold medal winner for Uzbekistan in the Olympiad. Serious talent. So let's take a look at that game. Carlsen against Abdusattorov. So Carlsen knows, going into this game, if he wins the tournament. A draw could be enough, certainly for a tiebreak, if Duda or Nakamura won. But, of course, he was trying to clear it all up with this final game. And he goes for e4. And a Spanish an opening that Carlsen has, well, throughout his career had success with. And he does love this pawn structure. Carlsen loves a fixed pawn structure. I'm sure you'll have noticed that in his games. And then he just understands how to maneuver around that. But anything can happen in these Spanish positions. It is highly complex. And Abdusattorov is a pretty sharp player. A4. So this is the age-old question that is put to black in the Spanish, where black has to decide what to do with the pawn on b5. So obviously white is threatening to take here, exploiting the pin. So what does black do? Do you play rook b8 but give up control of the file? Not that it's significant at the moment. Do you play bishop b7? But then again, sometimes that bishop is misplaced because it just bites on that pawn here. Or do you play b4? Well, that's what Abdusattorov did. And the game ran along familiar lines. We have knight d2. So this knight comes here, maybe looking at the c4 square, maybe later looking back at f1. And Carlsen has considerable experience with this position. Grishuk played bishop c5 against him in a previous game, Moscow 2012. d6 played, that's the more usual move. Here white has a choice. You can keep playing in sort of more positional style, a5, just clamping black on the queen side, or knight c4, also decent. But Carlsen goes for a move that he's had success with in the past, c3. So rook b8 supporting the b pawn and looking down the b file. So black already has counterplay there. Rook e1 supporting the pawn, perhaps preparing to drop the knight back here. Knight a5 pushes the bishop back. Of course, white wants to keep this important piece, the Spanish bishop, and c5. So now we can see that black, gets more influence over the center with the c pawn. That's why the knight was put to a5. And you can see I've highlighted that bishop can often come to e6. That's why it's often not great to put the bishop on b7, because it's doing nothing against the pawn on e4. But on c8 it can still potentially come out to e6 to exchange off this bishop here. And that's why Carlsen plays d4. So that means it's not going to be possible to exchange off. Well, that's a lot of tension in the position. All these possible pawn captures, pawn exchanges. And here, well, Carlsen, there's a famous game, Carlsen-Karyakin, Monte Carlo 2011, that went like this. And Carlsen ended up winning this game, an absolutely beautiful game. We've got game Carlsen against Adams, Moscow 2007, that went like this. Also a very nice game from Magnus Carlsen, very positional. And then we have this move that Abdusattorov played. He took on c3 and then took on d4 and brought the knight back to c6. Well, I have to say, I think that's to my eyes, a very logical continuation for black, because the knight is really not doing very much on a5. But coming back to c6, it puts pressure on d4. So white has to make a decision here. Do you push? Do you exchange? Do you leave it? And also the knight might just leap into b4. And there have been quite a few previous games, with bishop a3, which looks very logical. Controlling b4, looking down here. But Carlsen decides to play d5. It's not, not the most common move. But once again, I come back to this point I made earlier, that Carlsen loves fixed pawn structures. He somehow likes the security that brings. He's not going to be surprised by a pawn push or a pawn capture when the center is fixed like this. And the pawn on d5 does give white some space. So again, Carlsen preserves that important bishop, even though it doesn't look like much at the moment. But it does look down to a6. That could be a target later. And it controls important squares and can live very happily on this diagonal. Now, Abdusattorov plays what looks like a very aggressive move, knight h5, to come into f4. Seems fair enough. I think another way of playing this for black would be to play a5 to secure the knight on b4. Now, it might look a bit funny to potentially give the bishop that square, but that can always be countered with bishop d7. And that bishop can just, look at the a4 pawn as well. So that's a possibility. But knight h5. We have to remember this is a blitz game. These players just playing on instinct, and putting the knight on f4 does look reasonable. But notice how Carlsen clamps now with a5. Takes away the b6 square. Means that is a potential target. But also this knight isn't as secure when a5 from black has been ruled out. Knight f4. Now knight f1. So the knight drops back, opens this up. You never know. That could be interesting to take here sometimes. Of course, black is potentially angling to play f5 to get some pressure on the f-file. But having played knight f1, that's just not a good move. White can take and play e5. Well, we can see the strength of that bishop looking down here. And as ever, it can be risky to advance that f-pawn, opening up the king. Bishop g4. Well, in a blitz game, that looks like a very inviting move for black to play because, this pin is a bit annoying. When you put pressure on your opponent, things happen. But Carlsen played knight e3. Attacking the bishop, which dropped back. And now rook a3. So that covers the d3 square again. That could be useful. And, potentially it might cover the f3 knight as well. Queen c7. Yep, about time the rooks were connected. And a little bit of pressure here, so the knight can't move. I mean, one could just drop the bishop back to f1, but Carlsen goes for bishop d2, and that's a very tricky move. He has spied that that knight actually can't be supported by a pawn. It's covered by the rook at the moment. But, that's an uncomfortable move for black to face. For example, if, let's say, rook c8, then just queen a4, and that knight is actually in big trouble. You can see how, it was very useful to play that rook to a3 to cover the d3 square, so these knights can't hop in there. So bishop takes knight. Queen takes. Well, Abdusattorov did that in order to exchange off this knight. You wouldn't give up this light square bishop for no reason. Knight c2. Forcing knight takes. So queen takes. So it's just been an exchange of pieces. Now, who's benefited from that? Well, it's cleared some pieces from the board, and I think that benefits white. White wants to use this space advantage. Knight attacks the queen, can also hop into f5. That's the traditional outpost for the knight in the Spanish. If you can get there, then it's incredibly strong. Looking at the bishop, looking at d6, looking at g7 as well. And that knight on f4 isn't looking quite as wonderful as it did when it leapt in there a few moves ago. It's actually rather vulnerable now to the bishop. Queen d4. So Abdusattorov tries to maintain the pressure, which seems very reasonable. There's also a rook here on the open file. And Carlsen has to be a little bit careful about the back rank. Rook d1, but everything is covered at the moment. And here, well, it's not easy for black to find a good move, actually. You know, knight f5 is coming. If g6, then rook c3 is interesting, looking to come into c6. You know, then we can see how white uses this space advantage very well. Also, I can imagine that even with g6, knight f5 would have been a worrying move, because after this, after that's taken, bishop takes. It's a bit scary. In fact, black is just about okay here because queens are exchanged. And, well, okay, black can survive this, actually. The king can escape here. But, yeah, it's, you know, this kind of thing would be very worrying. Black is just about okay in that position. But I think it's understandable in a blitz game when you don't have time to calculate that the most natural thing to do after a move like rook d1 is you move the queen out of the way. But now the knight comes in and this is looking absolutely desperate for black. Bishop is attacked. Knight is attacked. The queen defends the rook. Now that's very important. So Carlsen has just managed to coordinate everything, basically. And this is a tough position. Bishop g5. Well, it's hard to find a good move for black here. h4. I mean, in a sense, white gains a move because the bishop has to just go back again. But it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. Rook c3. And now the queen has a very, well, uncomfortable decision to make because that pawn is dropping on d6 when the queen moves away. So queen takes a5. Now watch out for a discovered attack. g3. This is even better than cashing in straight away. You know, this knight is in huge trouble. It can go back to g6, but, well, watch what happens. h5 here. You can actually even play knight h6 here, but you can just take this. And that's just a huge position for white. Abdusattorov took on d5. That can be taken straight away, but Carlsen was probably concerned about e4. But rook a3 is even clearer. Discovered attack. Queen moves. Rook c1. Queen has to move again. And then pawn takes knight. And, well, Carlsen has captured this knight. He's a piece up. And there are no real complications here. Queen b2. He just manages to coordinate everything. King g2, nice steady move. King off the back rank, nice and tidy. And now rook c6. That rook has been threatening to come in on the c file for a long time. And yeah, it looks pretty bad, doesn't it, with that pawn on d6 under fire. And this is what happened. Knight d6, e4, and that got taken. Okay. Abdusattorov collapsed completely. And white is a piece up with a winning position. So that victory meant that Carlsen won the tournament on his own. Didn't matter what happened in the other games. In fact, Duda lost anyway to Sorana, and Nakamura only managed to draw against Pantala Hare Krishna. So final results were this. Carlsen winning by a clear point, 16 points. Nakamura and Martirosyan from Armenia both on 15 points. Nakamura, I think, got silver, Martirosyan bronze, but Magnus Carlsen out in front. An incredible achievement. He's now won the World Blitz Championship on 6 occasions, and to win that after winning the World Rapid the day before is just extraordinary. So, well, is he still classical world champion? I don't know. He's abandoned that one, but he continues to make his mark and make waves in the world of chess. Hope you enjoyed that. Do check out the Patreon, the channel Patreon page. If you want to have a look at that, it's patreon.com/PowerPlayChess. Do support the channel. Help us keep going into the next year. Okay, thanks very much for watching. Bye.